The man closest to John Paul II speaks of his saintly friend. Vatican II was his call. John the 23rd boldly blazed a new trail for the Church. Supreme Knight Carl Anderson remembers Mother Angelica with John Paul II. And pilgrims have thousands of souvenir choices. We take you to the streets of Rome. Those stories and many more directly from Rome on this special edition of EWTN News Nightly's Two Saints Forever coverage for Friday, April 25th, 2014. Welcome to EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick.
And I'm Alan Holdren.
It is great to be here in Rome with Alan for our very first edition on Friday of EWTN News Nightly. We're thrilled to be here for exclusive coverage of the historic canonization of Blesseds John Paul II and John the 23rd.
That's right, Brian. The countdown has begun. In less than 48 hours, these men will be made saints. Pope Francis will be presiding over that ceremony on Sunday morning.
And the excitement is building here tonight. We take a look at the lives of these two great men, starting with John Paul II, the first Polish Pope, the first non-Italian in 455 years, and a Pope who changed history. John Paul II will forever be remembered as the pontiff who helped bring down communism and inspired a generation of Catholics. For Marco Polito, the Vatican correspondent for an Italian newspaper, he was the first Pope of globalization.
He transformed the Roman Catholic papacy into the spokesman of liberty and human dignity all over the world.
Shortly after becoming Pope, John Paul II returned to Poland, where his anti-communist stance made him an ally of the Solidarity movement, which eventually led to the demise of communism in Eastern Europe. John Paul II's vast travels enabled millions of Catholics across the world to attend Mass, celebrated by the pontiff, to kiss his ring or shake his hand. He loved to meet with the people, often mixing within large crowds. In one of those crowds in St. Peter's Square in May of 1981, a gunman shot him. Once recovered from the assassination attempt, John Paul II swung back into action with more vigor than ever, eventually meeting with and forgiving the man who shot him. But in his later years, the Pope's grueling schedule began to take its toll. During public appearances, he often seemed exhausted. In February 2005, the Pope was admitted to a Rome hospital suffering from a severe bout of the flu. He died the following spring. John Paul II, soon to be Saint John Paul II.
And we all remember the death of John Paul II. That's when his sprint to sainthood began, with the crowd yelling Santo Subito, which literally means saint now. The man who was closest aide and friend was there by his side when he died. And I spoke to this man. This is the now Cardinal Stanislav Dziwisz, and he told me that John Paul II's fame for holiness started at a young age.
Yes, I knew him when he was not yet a bishop. He was our teacher, a great teacher in his science, but also as a man. You could see already from the human and religious standpoint, you could see he was a holy man. His colleagues in elementary school in Wauck, where he was born, they said of him that he was very joyful, very nice, and at the same time, they saw that there was something deeper inside him, looking at things in a deeper way. By his very nature, he was an artist, very sensitive to beauty, to creation. All of this led him to God.
E perciò tutto quello lo portava verso Dio.
If there was a message to give to the John Paul II generation, to be recalled in the world in these days, what would it be?
Soprattutto
Having known him, those who knew John Paul II as a man could not remain indifferent. As a person, he had a very close relationship with people. The people who came out after being with him came out changed. I repeat what I have certainly witnessed and also heard from many other people who were in contact with him. His exchanges gave peace, and he was very sensitive to the serious and spiritual things.
Più grande sensibilità alle cose serie spirituali.
So the exceptional thing about that interview, Brian, was that he said that from the very beginning of the day, Pope John Paul II would start his mornings in the chapel with prayer, and he'd be in prayer all throughout the day, just extraordinary in every moment.
And everyone I've talked to that had met John Paul II in person noticed that holiness about him in those encounters.
That's right. And joining us now is Father John Wauck. He's from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross here in Rome, and he knows a lot about John Paul II and his legacy. John, when was the first time that you came across this Pope?
The first time I encountered John Paul II was at an Easter audience here in Rome in 1979, the first Easter with John Paul II. I was 15 years old, and it was an enormous audience here in the Aula Nervi. People were screaming, shouting, cheering for 15 minutes. When he entered, there was a standing ovation for 15 minutes. And I remember thinking, this is what it must have been like to be at a Beatles concert. The image that you see of the girls fainting and everyone tearing up, people diving over each other to be able to touch the Pope. I was able to shake the Pope's hand at that time. And it was a moment in my life that I'll never forget.
Do you have a picture of that?
There is a picture in my family's house.
How did that change you as a young man?
Well, it was around that time that I decided to give my life to God. So it was actually a very important moment. I decided to live a life of celibacy, and later that led to the priesthood. So it was right around that time that I was deciding what to make of my own life. And obviously John Paul's example was an important part of that.
You had that effect on vocations throughout the United States, really.
Oh yeah, there's a whole generation of priests who are JP2 priests, but not just on priests, like on lay people as well. Just today, I was at St. Peter's talking with a guy who's worked with politicians of presidents of the United States, and he was remembering the brief minute that he had with John Paul II, and the look in John Paul's eyes that changed his life. It brought him back to the faith, because he was kind of a fallen away Catholic. And that was the moment when he decided, I really need to get back on track.
Father John, we'll have a moment to talk more in just a moment.
So, of course, the other man of the hour is Pope John XXIII, nicknamed the Good Pope. Even though he was Pope for just less than 5 years, he left a deep imprint on the Church, the world, and humanity as a whole.
John XXIII's legacy will certainly be the convening of the Second Vatican Council. He was born Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli in 1881 in a small town in northern Italy called Sotto il Monte. Roncalli was elected Pope in 1958 at the age of 76. Today, bronze casts of his face and hand are on display in this church in his hometown. The house he grew up in is now this museum. Here, visitors can view a number of the late Pope's personal items, including his cardinal vestments. John XXIII was dubbed the Good Pope for his loving and affectionate way with people. His pontificate lasted just under 5 years. He called an ecumenical council just a few months after his election. Vatican II, among other things, allowed for Mass to be celebrated in the languages of the faithful, rather than in Latin. In the years since Vatican II closed in 1965, it has become a source of division in the Church. Critics blame a faulty interpretation of Vatican II's true meaning for the fall in priestly vocations and a crisis of faith in the Church today. In September 2013, Pope Francis bypassed typical Vatican procedures to unilaterally declare that John XXIII be canonized along with John Paul II. As is the Pope's wish, the Good Pope will be made a saint without the traditional confirmation of a second miracle attributed to his intercession.
So, Father John, do you know of any other popes that have been beatified or canonized together?
Well, there have been double beatifications, but not double canonizations. This is a first for the history of the Church, and it's not just any two popes. There's two popes who are really from the same era, whose lives intersected with one another. It was John Paul who beatified, in fact, John XXIII.
And Father, what about the idea that we have two living popes for the first time in history, or certainly in recent history? There's a lot of question whether Benedict will be there. I have no doubt he will. What do you think?
I'm told that he will be. I've talked with people in the Vatican, and it seems certain that he will be there tomorrow. So we'll have essentially 4 popes sharing the stage, 2 to be canonized and 2 to watch.
Yeah, I should point out that there will be a pope and a pope emeritus.
Emeritus.
Benedict is he's very clear about that. He says there's
right.
only one pope. So
right.
Just your own thought about being part of this experience now. I know it's just exhilarating for me.
Right. Well, I think it's just a wonderful celebration. It's a celebration of holiness, and I think there's going to be in the square just a spirit of joy and a sense of culmination of a great story, a story of holiness lived in the 20th century by two, very, very central figures in the life of the church who really transformed the church in different ways for our times.
And you would have been here during the beatification of John Paul II just 3 years ago. How did you live that experience?
Well, it was one of those celebrations that you're waiting for. I think, and everyone knew when John Paul died that he was going to be beatified. And so there is, as I say, that sense of culmination. But of course, the beatification is only the beginning, and it's the canonization that we've really been waiting for.
Well, Father John Wauck, we appreciate you joining us this evening, and we look forward to celebrating with you on Sunday.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, coming up, we're going to talk to an American who works in the Vatican, and she'll tell us how the new saints are still impacting the lives of women around the world.
And later, a U.S. ambassador to the Holy See will be with us to share his memories of John Paul II. Stay with us.
Welcome back to EWTN News Nightly in Rome for our special canonization coverage. I'm Brian Patrick.
And I'm Alan Holdren. John Paul II had a very good relationship with women.
He reached out to them in person as well as his many writings, but he inherited that sensitivity toward women from John the 23rd.
Both speak about how important it is for the woman to not to try and imitate men also in work, but try and be to humanize the work of and try and be maternal also in her profession, to create bonds, to bring her genius, her intuition, her professionalism, but not giving up her femininity.
Pope John Paul II was a spiritual father for me, and I read his poetry, especially when I was experiencing bouts of adolescent depression or angst. I would read his poetry, and I would reflect on it, but I didn't understand it. And I took that book with me for years, just wherever I was going, spiritual retreats, or if I was going camping, I had that book as one of my favorite books of poetry.
Jane Adolphe is with us right now. She's an associate professor at the Ave Maria School of Law. She's speaking with us right now in that capacity. She also works at the Vatican Secretary of State. Can we ask you, Jane, what was John Paul II's take on the relationship between men and women?
Well, in a nutshell, he spoke about men and women are equal in inherent dignity, but different, complementary, and called to collaboration and communion. And it's this synthesis that's just an unbelievable and beautiful statement.
And he cautioned against going to extremes.
That's right. There's a tendency to see an endless power struggle between men and women on one hand, or to try to paint one sex as superior over the other.
Well, and he had these long discussions in his audiences that incorporated theology of the body, which we now have as a great gift from the saint. Was that one of the ways that he tried to transmit this message?
Absolutely. And he used not only that forum, but he used a number of other platforms. And one in particular that was probably surprising to some Catholics is even the United Nations Forum.
And that's also been a forum in recent years for speaking about a number of issues, including gender and ideology.
Exactly. And so what's the beauty and there is that for some Catholics you talk about the United Nations as being this evil institution, especially on life, faith, and family issues. However, he understood the strengths and weaknesses and then masterfully and brilliantly forged all of his talents to work effectively within that institution for good.
Now, he coined the phrase feminine genius, and of course Pope Francis refers to that as well. What do you think he meant by that?
Wow, that will be fleshed out for the next I don't know how many years. So there's nothing, that is the genius of the Pope in saying the genius of women that's now still being studied.
What would you say is feminine genius?
The feminine genius, I think, is the uniqueness of women to appreciate them being in relationship with others. And it starts really with the sensitivity in childbirth, the bond that happens in childbirth, and the fact that we want to be accessible to all kinds of different people on different levels. So instead of putting things in boxes, we're open and we're thinking about relationships and communication. But when you talk about that, it's not like men is excluded from that, it's the tonality. that's there.
It's a good take.
And Pope Francis has also been talking about taking a deeper look at the role of women within the church. You work within the church in an important role. How do you expect those reforms to take place, and what role will women have in the church in the coming years?
Well, when I look at that, when I listen to those type of questions in terms of the church per se, as a layperson outside the Vatican, I'm part of that church, and so the fact that women are living out the sacrament of marriage, having children, teaching children is part of that church. In terms of working within the Secretary of State or hierarchical structure, I think, and my job in particular, is really making, in terms of analysis on certain legal issues, is to make sure that that continues. You don't want, for example, the state impinging on a woman and how many numbers of children she has, or whether she can educate them.
Well, Jane Adolphe, we really appreciate the great insight that you offered, and we'll celebrate this wonderful occasion with you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
Carl Anderson, the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, knew John Paul II personally and worked with him on the many projects over the years. He also worked with Mother Angelica closely. We spoke with him about this in our Two Saints Forever coverage. It's an honor to be here in Rome with the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. Carl, first of all, I want to thank you for your generous support of EWTN, especially News Nightly. We are very grateful.
Well, if I could say thank you to you for realizing a dream that so many of us have had for a long time, a Catholic nightly news program.
And we are living it here in Rome as we celebrate the canonizations of two great popes. There's a real tie between EWTN and this celebration, especially as it has to do with John Paul II.
Well, Mother Angelica and I had the privilege of being with John Paul II in the early 1980s to go to his private mass, and then afterwards Mother presented him with a model of the first satellite dish that she was putting in Alabama. And John Paul II was so joyful, so enthusiastic about what Mother was doing, that there would be this evangelization of the communications media from a Catholic perspective. And so today is so great because we remember John Paul II, and in a special way, Mother Angelica is here too.
Yeah, we bring her here with us. Now, the Knights of Columbus had a wonderful relationship with John Paul II. Share a little bit of that with us.
Well, we had the opportunity to cooperate with so many projects with him, restoring the facade of St. Peter's, working to support his idea of the common Christian roots of Europe, bringing East Europe and West Europe together, working with the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family, getting the laity involved in the new evangelization, promoting vocations to the priesthood and religious life. So point after point, we tried our best to be strong supporters of John Paul II.
And now in Washington, we will have a national shrine to this great saint.
Yes, and that's another part of the Knights of Columbus cooperation with him still, the legacy. And so that we bring into the 21st century his thinking, his spirituality, his path of discipleship for laity, for clergy, for religious, for our families. It's going to be a great place, and I hope many millions of Catholics throughout North America will come and visit, because they will see a very special spiritual center of John Paul II.
Carl, I got to see John Paul II once when he came the first time to the United States in Chicago. I was there covering it. You got to know him. Can we wrap this up by just hearing your just personal joy of the sainthood of JP2?
Well, to me, I saw him first when he came for the Mass on the Mall in Washington, and that changed my life as it did millions of other Catholics. In fact, I date kind of the renewal of the Catholic Church in America from that trip of John Paul II. So to see him now affirmed by the official church, what the entire world knew for years, that we had this great saint, this great pope, and how lucky we are, with all the challenges that face the Catholic Church today, to have such a succession of holy, spiritual, courageous popes leading our church.
We are blessed, and we're very grateful to you and the Knights of Columbus.
Hey,
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, the Knights are such an important part of our church, and we appreciate them here at EWTN for the great support we've received.
Joining us now is Ambassador Jim Nicholson. He was the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See from 2001 to 2005. Ambassador Nicholson, you were here for the transition between Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI. What was that like?
Actually, I had left. I was gone 5 weeks when Pope John Paul II died. President Bush asked me to come home, be the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. But we had a very poignant moment before that because he asked my wife and me to come over to his apartment when we were leaving Rome. We'd been here for almost 4 years, and he actually knighted me for the work I did on GMO food and trafficking people. And he was very sick, but he wanted to talk about how the U.S. was going to continue to project its natural resources, its material resources, and what we thought about, you know, the secular drift that was in stream in the U.S. And we had a very poignant conversation with a man who was really on death's doorstep, but I'll never forget it.
So late in his life, and he was so feeble at that time. He had been such a vibrant, vigorous man. How in that infirmity, in his elderliness, did he show his sainthood? Were you able to see that?
We saw it almost every day, or every week, because he was forbearing, he was continuing on, and he was not self-indulgent at all, and he was, you know, suffering physically greatly. So he was an inspiration for those of us who were, you know, working around him. And he, you know, he never said this either, but you just knew that he was thinking of Christ, you know, and his suffering all the time, and as he was progressing or digressing into his Parkinson's and many other maladies as well. He was always in pain, it seemed like, but he had a continuing good sense of humor, attempted to laugh and crack jokes. The president came here 3 times to see him, President Bush did, and we had some very funny moments. Another, I remember a cardinal here telling me that Pope called him over to his office kind of late in the game and asked him if he would take over the fabric of St. Peter's, the Fabrica. And he said, I am humbled, Your Holiness, he said, but I don't know anything about the art and the mosaics. And the Pope looked at him and said slowly as he was talking, then he said, do you think I knew how to be Pope?
But I did it anyway.
Yeah.
What a treasure. Thank you for sharing that story with us, Ambassador Nicholson.
Great to be with you.
Up next, John Paul II didn't stay put very long. He took more than 100 international trips. We're going to hear from his spokesman, who is with him every step of the way.
Plus, we'll show you what's going on around the Vatican today. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to EWTN News Nightly in Rome. John Paul II went out into the world like no other pope before him.
He was a globetrotter. He visited more than 120 countries, including the U.S., 5 times. With him along the way was his spokesman, Joaquín Navarro-Valls.
De que el Papa Juan Pablo II era un gran comunicador es una afirmación que tiene razón, pero puede ser equívoca. Porque es un gran comunicador no por el modo como dice las cosas, que era un modo bellísimo.
This was the secret of his success, if we want to use that word, in communicating with young people. You could say that the Pope worked with the media. The Pope was carrying out his ministry, but the media was fascinated by what this man was doing around the world. The result was that he put the focus on God in the first place, which was something for which our culture was in great need.
Brian, Navarro-Valls was the first layperson to be the spokesman of the Pope.
And he had to know the Pope very well to actually speak for him.
Yeah. So joining us now is Ana Cristina Villa. She's from the Pontifical Council for the Laity. And we wanted to ask you, Ana Cristina, the Pope John Paul II had a way of resonating with people. He made an effect on every single person. How did you see that effect?
Oh, it was incredible. Every time that he traveled around the world, he really immediately connected with so many countries, with so many people. And in my work, I get to get a lot of feedback, especially from women. Women were particularly touched by him, and his words on women are very important and have really made a difference, I think, historical, that we will be celebrating particularly this weekend.
And certainly he had an impact on priests, clergy, religious, but how about the laity in general? That's your area of expertise.
Yes, oh, very much so. I think because he lived out to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council that stressed so much the importance of the laity within the church, and the fact that the church are part of the laity. The church are the laity, are the church within the world, you know, bringing the church everywhere to all the environments of the secular world. And with his, for example, his document Christi Fideles Laici is a very important clue for all the vocation of the lay people in the world. So we keep going back to that again and again for inspiration in what needs to be done in these new times.
We are the church. Thank you for being with us. All right, EWTN, of course, provides full live coverage of Sunday's canonization. All begins at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be here along with Raymond Arroyo and the EWTN News Nightly team. Join us as we witness history being made. For EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Alan. Tonight we leave you with a flavor of what's going on here today in Rome.
All the world to thank him. So why not coming here and telling him thank you in our way, in Lebanese way. John Paul II, we love you. And in Arabic, John Paul II, منحبك.